Okay, this morning we're looking at exercise 10, audience needs for James 1 and 1 Thessalonians 4. And as I noted at the beginning of the exercise, the Spirit of God inspired His Word to meet real needs of real people. Humbly request His enablement to see the needs of the original audience as He saw them, and then to see those same needs in contemporary society. This is an important exercise in helping you train yourself to think about how a text reflects the needs of the original audience. Most of us are very tuned in to our own needs or contemporary needs, but if we're going to address contemporary needs properly, we have to locate texts that don't seem to, just on the surface, address them, but rather contextually support the conclusion that, in fact, these are the needs that were understood. Oftentimes, what we think are contemporary needs turn out not to be so great, and what Scripture identifies as needs turn out to be the root issues as opposed to symptoms. So, in this exercise, you are to identify the needs, problems, or issues of the original audience that the text explicitly addresses. Now, when I say text, I don't mean only the verses that you have chosen. And McDill doesn't either. We have to look at the context as a whole. So, there are various trials that are being experienced. Their faith is being tested. For example, there's the poverty of the poor that we see in chapter 1, verses 9 to 11. Let the poor man boast in his poverty. Let the rich man glory in his humility. We see descriptions of poor people coming into the church in chapter 2. Of injustice being experienced in chapter 5, where their wages are not being paid or they're being abused by the rich. And there's sickness in the church, chapter 5. So there's quite a variety of trials that the text itself addresses. I think we could say that there's some spiritual issues in the church as well. There's double-mindedness that is talked about, and specifically the double-minded man is unstable in all his ways in 1:8, chapter 4, verse 8. Purify your hearts, you double-minded. And interestingly enough, the same word that shows up as unstable, that a double-minded man is unstable in all his ways, shows up as well in chapter 3, describing the wisdom that is from below produces this kind of instability. Their faith needs to be strengthened. They have a lack of wisdom. They're being tempted by evil. They have need for endurance. They need to be made perfect. All of these are things that I see as needs of the original audience. Did you see a need that I don't have listed here?
So I had some general terms that included those, but I probably should have had specifics.
So when you say you went off the research you did, do you mean you didn't look at the text again in the process of doing that?
I did not.
Yeah. So, by all means, keep the text open and engage with it at each stage. All right. Number 2, identify the human issues that the author addresses in the text by implication. Example questions to help identify implicit needs. What needs do the explicit needs necessarily imply? Okay, so let me just make sure you understand the difference between explicit and implicit. Explicit is it's stated in black and white there in the text. Implicit is it's not there in the text, but what is said necessarily leads to the conclusion that other things are true. So, that would be implicit. So I noticed some things here. Implicitly, there is a lack of faith that God is at work in this trial to make me perfect, complete, lacking nothing. Probably, I think it's likely that there's a different view of trials. Trials are problems to be gotten rid of, to be gotten through as quickly as possible, because the good life is a trial-free life. And therefore, I want to live the good life. I need to get rid of my trials. Probably a readiness to complain during trials. If you're being told to count it joy, it's likely that you're doing something other than counting it joy. Okay. I think the text implies that they need more endurance, since their faith is being tried to produce endurance. Okay. And if joy is satisfaction in God, as I've argued throughout the class, then perhaps they were not finding their satisfaction in God during trials. I think we're inclined naturally, because of the fall, to find our satisfaction in when things go well for us, according to our view of what well is. Okay. So, rather than finding our satisfaction in God, that God is enough for me, He's more than enough for me, and whatever God chooses to give me or to not give me is a reflection of His wisdom and goodness. Is that the way you think? I don't have this because God doesn't want me to have this at this particular point in time. Because if He wanted me to have this at this particular point in time, I would have it. Provided, of course, that I'm walking in the light and I'm asking according to His will and not for selfish motives. Any questions about what I said on number 2? All right, number 3, briefly identify the various kinds of persons whose needs or problems or issue this text addresses. Well, the truth of the matter is, there is no person whose need this text does not address. Everybody experiences trials, and the more faith-trying those trials are, the more likely they are to be challenging to their trust in God. Question?
On the second one there, is that also the entire book, or is that just, did you just do 2 verses?
Now here, once we get to the implicit, we limit it to the text alone. Yeah, so explicit, the whole book, implicit, and probably, so let me just talk, for example, about Romans 12:1. Paul says, I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, wholly acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. All right, so the explicit needs in the book of Romans are very broad. It's huge. So, everything from needing to know whether God's word had failed to Israel in chapters 9 through 11, to needing to understand that God makes no difference between the Jew and the Greek. Everybody's a sinner and everybody gets saved the same way, to understanding what justification by faith is, to understanding how to relate to government. So, when we get an epistle like Romans, where what's happening in our text is fairly narrow, then I'm not going to pay as much attention to the rest of the book's explicit needs as I am going to pay attention to the text itself. But when I got a text like a word like trials in James, Well, but it doesn't tell me what trials he's talking about, so I have to go looking, right? So I think it's not just that on explicit we go a whole book, implicit we goes limited to the passage. I'm actually using what's in the passage to help gauge how broad or narrow I should move. In the case of 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, where we're addressing holiness as it applies to moral purity, I don't see anything else in the rest of the book that talks much about moral purity. Okay? So, since that's the case, then I don't need to broaden my search that much. I do see that they're saved, that they're on fire for God, and apparently saved, on fire for God people may need to be told that they're not supposed to commit immorality. Okay? So, recognizing that larger context keeps me from assuming that, bless God, if you really get saved, and if you're really on fire for God, nobody'd have to tell you this. This is not true. Good question. Thanks for bringing that up. So, what number 3 does is 3 asks you to create a scenario. And in this scenario, you just sketch out a brief possible audience. Now, I often find that college students sketch out college scenarios, okay, because they're only thinking inside their little world bubble. But unless you're preaching this to a college audience, which I plan for you to preach this beyond a college audience, you need to think beyond the college audience. Okay? So, Roger got to work at the U.S. Post Office and found a pink slip in his box. And just that morning, his wife had told him that the freezer had quit working, and they'd already had the washing machine go out a week before. And here he gets a notice that he's going to be laid off from his job. How are they going to get the washing machine fixed? How are they going to get the freezer fixed? All that food's going to go to waste? God, what are you doing? Well, so what? I just gave you the symptoms. I just gave you what are his underlying assumptions? Yeah, the fact that you ask God, what are you doing, means that you think that he isn't doing what he ought to be doing. Because if somebody's doing what they're supposed to do, you don't ask, what are you doing? What are some of the consequences of the experience? Well, he's discouraged. Maybe he's depressed. He's tempted to feel like God doesn't care about him. Now, there's Roger's story. Mary just had her first child. And she's going through postpartum depression. And at your age, I didn't know that postpartum depression existed. But for Mary, the world looks like a black hole from which there is no escape. She's dismayed that she feels no love for her child, that she has bizarre thoughts of harming her child, wonders if she's losing her mind. And you're going to get up there and say, my brothers, count it all joy when you fall into various kinds of trials. And she's going to think, that guy's out of touch. And God is gone. And my life is falling apart. Now, that's very real. That's where ordinary people live. And they need to hear something about, in Mary's case, she needs to find out that how you feel, that counting it joy is not a matter of how you feel. You can feel depressed, and you can feel forsaken, you can feel abandoned and still count it joy. How do I know that? My God, why have you forsaken me? Comes from the one who, for the joy that was set before him, endured the cross, despised the shame. So, God is more than enough, even when He doesn't seem to be around. And what God is doing is working in your life to build your faith muscles, that when you can't see His hand, when you can't sense His presence, when you can't sing your way out of the blues, that God is still good, and that God is still wise, and that God is still at work in your plan, in your life. Now, brothers, there's some solid truth for real life issues. There's meat for the soul. Questions? All right, let me come over to the 1 Thessalonians one. So, what are the needs, problems, or issues of the original audience? Well, apparently some of them were not controlling their lustful passions. They needed to be told to do that. There was at least the possibility of sexual immorality, if not the actuality of sexual immorality. Okay. And in your congregation, the likelihood is pretty high that there are people who are either faking that they're Christians or trying to be Christians, and sexual immorality is a real issue in their life. And other people who it's been an issue in their past, and it occasionally comes up and becomes a challenge to them. Maybe defrauding of brothers is going on. Apparently they need to be rewarned because he does it again. He warned you before, so we're going to warn you again. One told you once, isn't that enough? No, of course it's not enough. Okay. God even rewarns people. They need to understand the implication of being set apart to God. What does holiness entail? Is holiness just a badge you stick on your lapel and you say, I got the holiness badge. As long as I wear my badge, I'm good to go. Okay. Some appear to be rejecting the warning they received, or at least inclined to reject Paul's warning, because then Paul kind of lowers the boom. He that rejects not man but God. So Paul must have anticipated some degree of resistance to what he was saying. What are the human issues the author addresses in the text by implication? Example questions. What do the explicit needs necessarily imply? How do the explicit needs relate implicitly to the need to love God and others? What faith-related need does the text imply the audience has? Okay. Question? Okay. Well, let's see here. Implicit needs. One of the things that strikes me is the need to know that you don't have to do what you feel like doing. And another implicit need is the need to know that what's, quote, natural may not be holy, slide that up so you can see it here. It just feels right. Well, sure it feels right. It's natural. Just because it's natural doesn't mean it's right. And that gets at, this points to recognizing our fallenness as humans. If we are not fallen, then what is natural should be right. But if we're fallen, natural reflects our twisted, distorted, contorted nature. Let's see. Can you think of any other implicit needs that could be found in this text? I think there's an implicit need to depend upon the Holy Spirit for enablement to live a morally pure life. Capitalization. Now, it's really important to me that when you guys preach this message in class, that you not address the class. I do not want you preaching to a room full of college guys. You are going to be preaching to a Sunday evening crowd that's got everything from kids to grannies in it. And I do that because I think that, number one, you need to learn how to talk about things that the Bible talks about in a way that don't get you into trouble with your congregation. Number two, to get you out of your own social location so that you think past the challenges that male college students, most of whom are unmarried, encounter. And number three, should have a female in the class. So that represents a population that this text addresses as much as it addresses males. And it's very easy for men to think only like men when they're talking about issues that are particularly strikingly relevant to men, but and then forget that they're relevant to women as well. So I would encourage you to, let me just give you some example categories of people. So you've got unmarried secretary in corporation, whose boss is making advances. Okay, you've got a married lab worker whose co-worker is sharing the woes of his marriage. We've got teens in the throes of infatuation. we've got a couple who is engaged to be married within a year. I can't tell you how many times I've had somebody say to me, well, we're going to get married anyway. And the sad thing is that in more cases than not, they didn't end up getting married. I also have had a pastor sit in my office and say, Phil, my wife and I cannot enjoy some aspects of what God intended married people to enjoy in their sexual relationship because it conjures up so much guilt in my wife for what we did before we were married that guilt destroys any ability to enjoy what God intended for marriage. And he said, I wish I was 19. I was young. Nobody told me these things. Nobody warned me. And he's in his mid-40s, late 40s, and living with regret for decade after decade after decade. I can assure you, gentlemen, if there were ladies, I'd say ladies too, that God's way is always the best way. You never regret pursuing holiness in your relationships, pursuing moral purity. There can only be regret when you don't do that. All right. Now, do you see how we're getting at the need here? Depending on your congregation, you just pay attention to the kinds of context. So, if I were on the eastern seaboard and had sailors in my congregation, I would talk about the fact that Thessalonica was a seaport town and had sailors coming and going. The fact that it was a wicked city that had prostitution and that it had regular prostitution as well as temple prostitution. And having a mistress was kind of par for the course for the upper middle class, if you could afford it. It was really a matter of economics, not a matter of ethics. Plenty of opportunity for immorality, although homosexuality was not universally smiled upon, and in some places distinctly frowned on. It was more a matter of preference and taste than a matter of morality. Pedophilia was quite common. So if you've been saved out of that background, you don't think of yourself as a Christian growing up inside that background. Think of yourself as a sinner coming out of that background. Now you have to have a complete transformation of your idea of sex, period. Yes?
Where did you find out most of your information about this one?
I would have looked in the Zondervan Pictorial Bible Backgrounds Encyclopedia. I would have looked in the introduction to commentaries, particularly the Baker Exegetical Commentary series. I look at the Expositor's Bible Commentary series. Good. Other questions? Yes.
I was just looking at the text again. Do you think another implicit need could be to see that God is truly passionate about moral purity? And they talk about him being the avenger.
Sure. Yeah, that's a good one. Need to see that God is passionate about moral purity. He is the avenger of those who defrauded. Good. This matters to God. Probably you don't have time in this message, but it's in terms of pastoring people and helping them understand God's view of holiness and moral purity. It seems like people need to hear the pastor say, God is the one who thought up sex. Sex is not a dirty word. It's not a bad thing. It's, in fact, a divine design. It's a blessing that God intends to give as a gift in marriage. And so I told my boys that just like you spoil your Christmas present if you pull off the wrapping and peek at what the present is before Christmas, so we spoil God's intended gift and in fact harm ourselves, right? Paul says in 1 Corinthians 6, every sin that a man does is outside the body, but he who commits fornication sins against himself. So there's a unique sense in which sexual immorality is damaging to the person. And what a shame to take what God intends to be a joy, a blessing, and turn it into something that's harmful to you. And that's exactly the way the devil works. He wants to take what's good and twist it so that it becomes harmful. Questions?